Now this bill kind of backs me into a corner where I cannot even present the facts because someone may be offended.
I promise you something's going to happen. Some kid's going to videotape a lesson where a teacher's saying something and it's going to go viral, and Lakeisha and others are going to wonder, what in the heck am I doing? I'm just trying to help kids.
Now more than ever, I think schools are at the forefront of really helping young people and society as a whole understand our role as people in this country, and that democracy is not innate.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Teacher Stories. This is your host, Ken Futernick, and today's episode is part of a special series we are conducting on an important and timely question. What can schools do to help save our democracy? Now, each of our three guests today is from the state of Texas. There's a lot going on in Texas, I'm sure, as many of you know, that is testing our democratic systems and values. Debates over voter rights, whether school districts can mandate masks to prevent the ongoing spread of COVID. But today, we're going to talk about something else going on in Texas that also has far-reaching implications for our democracy. The Texas State Legislature recently passed a bill, House Bill 3979, that goes into effect September 1st, about 2 weeks from today, just as schools are opening up in the state. This bill will restrict what teachers can do and say in the classroom. More specifically, let me describe some of these restrictions. Teachers cannot be required to participate in training about race, sexual stereotyping. Teachers cannot promote the idea with students that meritocracy or hard work ethic are racist or sexist. It requires teachers who discuss controversial topics or current events, like, say, the January 6th insurrection or the George Floyd murder, to explore the topic from contending perspectives without giving deference to any one perspective. It also prohibits schools from giving academic credit for students' political activism, lobbying, or efforts to persuade members of the legislature or executive branch at the federal, state, or local level to take specific actions by direct communication. Now, Texas is not alone in placing these restrictions on teachers. As of July 2021, legislators in more than 20 states have introduced similar legislation. So let me introduce today's guests and see what they think about the Texas bill and its impact on learning and on democracy itself. First, I'm pleased to welcome Michael Hinojosa, Superintendent of the Dallas Independent Schools, the second largest in Texas and the 17th largest in the United States. Dr. Hinojosa, welcome to Teacher Stories.
Thanks, Ken. Thanks for having me on this very important topic, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Great. And next we have Mary Gonzalez, a representative of the Texas State Legislature. And in 2012, she was elected to represent House District 12, that includes East El Paso County. She serves on several committees, including the Public Education Committee. Welcome, Mary.
Welcome, I'm excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
And finally, I'm pleased to welcome Lakeisha Patterson. Lakeisha teaches third grade at Deepwater Elementary School near Houston.
Hi, Ken. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to join this conversation.
Great. Okay, let's talk about the new Texas bill, House Bill HB 3979. And I want to start by asking Representative Gonzalez to provide some background on that bill that was passed in June and that will restrict what teachers can do in the classroom. And I do want to point out that I had invited the author of that bill, Representative Steve Toth, to join this conversation. And I submitted that request a few weeks ago and unfortunately never heard back, but I was disappointed because I thought it would make for an important dialogue among people that might not agree with one another. But Mary, you were there when the bill was being debated and voted on. Can you shed some light on the bill and what do you think the effects will be on schools in Texas?
Sure, Ken. I've been in the legislature for 10 years, And if Texas is very unique. We only meet every 2 years for 140 days. So usually big pieces of legislation, for example, a few years ago, we passed a very big school finance bill. These elements were discussed for a whole year before the actual session. If you would have told me in November or even December right before session that we were going to be dealing with an anti-critical race theory debate in the legislature, I would have never believed you. It really came out of nowhere, which speaks to a little bit of its political strategic reality in this moment. So it came out of nowhere and very rapidly became one of the top issues for statewide leadership. The bill passed. And I think what was very concerning, and if an individual can go back and watch the debate, is really a misunderstanding of critical race theory and a lack of understanding of what the implications are for passing such a policy. So while the policy in itself is bad, particularly in a moment where the majority of our students are students of color in Texas, the implications are even greater. I'll give an example. We know we have a teacher shortage in Texas and across the country. We also have heard from organizations like Teach for America, for example, that they have a drop in teacher recruits because of pieces of legislation like the anti-CRT bill. Additionally, we know that there is already an extraordinary amount of stress for our teachers and our students. Pieces of legislation like this not only create problems with curriculum, but also increase anxiety and fear for teachers and even students about what they can and cannot talk about. The implications are much larger than just a piece of legislation, which is harmful in itself.
Well, thank you for the background on that. Dr. Hinojosa, I want to come to you and have you share your thoughts about what you think the implications of this bill will have for teachers and students and parents and the communities in your school district in Dallas.
Well, thank you for having this important conversation. And there's kind of a little context. My board unanimously passed a racial equity policy about 3 years ago, way before any of this stuff started happening. And it was unanimous, and we have 3 Black, 3 white, and 3 Latino board members. And so it's something that we believe in deeply. And so when these kinds of things happen, I always tell people, don't panic. I'll let you know when it's time to panic, when I need you to help me make some noise, but right now is not the time to panic. Why would I say that? I said that when the Trump administration came up with some of this immigration policy, and I had to go on Univision and Telemundo to calm people down because everybody was afraid that they were going to get deported tomorrow. And so it's my responsibility as a leader to take the lead on these kinds of matters. In addition, I was a government teacher, so I know that the legislative branch makes the laws. The executive branch is supposed to enforce the laws. Well, the legislative branch made the law, but it's very vague, and it doesn't even and so people don't even know what's really going to happen. Enforcement doesn't start until September the 1st. And as you know, we've had multiple special sessions where this is being considered. And then, of course, there's always the judicial branch, which interprets whether this law is constitutional or not. If we get further down this cycle, then I'll tell people it's time to panic. But our board believes in it so much. And since it didn't go into effect till September the 1st, when we first had one of our former students, a 29-year-old African-American young lady whose mom was white, her dad was Black, and he was killed by a police officer in Dallas. And she became one of our best teachers. And now she's our trainer for racial equity, and she's lived it. And so she trained me and my team, and she trained the board. And so she did a phenomenal job. And our board loved it so much, they said, we want everybody to get trained this year. So that's what we're doing on cultural competence. And so we're getting everybody trained before this law goes into effect. So we're already trained. By the time the law goes into effect, we'll beat them to the punch. And so it's just one of those things that, you have to deal with these kind of things. And my job is to protect the employees and tell them, look, we got your back. As long as you're following our policies, we'll defend you. And this is something that's very important to us. And in fact, now they've demonized something that we use during this training. we learned that a lot of people are uncomfortable talking about race. But when you show a video that was done by PBS about redlining and how this was actually done by the federal government deliberately, then people say, wait a minute, the people that were very raw about not talking about this is, let's have a conversation. Well, now they've demonized that too. So stay tuned, we'll see what happens, but I'm just trying to keep people calm and making sure that we just take this in a very deliberate way in how we handle this stuff that's coming at us.
You know, I want to go back to something that Representative Gonzalez said about teacher shortages. I can imagine that there are some young teachers in your district in Dallas who are not tenured yet, don't have job security and could be let go, or people thinking about becoming teachers in your district or anywhere in Texas thinking, I don't know if I want to go in and put myself at risk. And despite the fact that you say you have my back, I'm worried about what could happen to me if I talk about race or sexual stereotyping and what the bill doesn't really say what can happen, but maybe I could be sued by a parent, and teaching is hard enough. I don't want to have to worry about that. So what would you say to a young teacher in your district that came to you and said, I'm not sure I want to continue teaching here?
Well, I tell them just to hang with us, but I promise you something's going to happen. Some kid's going to videotape a lesson where a teacher's saying something and it's going to go viral, and Lakeisha and others are going to wonder, what in the heck am I doing? I'm just trying to help kids. Well, I'm saying, look, we believe in this so much that we're going to support you, and you can make the biggest difference in urban America by being a teacher and staying in the classroom, staying with us. It's not going to be easy, but just hang on. We got your back.
Well, let's go to a person who's actually teaching in the classroom. Lakeisha Patterson, you're a third grade teacher, and tell us what your thoughts are about this bill and the implications for you personally and for teachers in Texas.
I think I agree with both what Dr. Hinojosa was saying and Representative Gonzalez said. First of all, we have a significant teacher shortage here in Texas. So it seems like legislation like this already amplifies a problem that we're experiencing. And it's used to silence the voices of those who already feel so marginalized. Being an African-American teacher myself, I feel that there's so many culturally important events and pieces of history that are important that we discuss. And this piece of legislation basically says, no, we'll continue to silence, the voices of those who have gone through periods of oppression. And that's disturbing. I also agree that I feel some of the events that occurred in 2020 kind of projected this forward in really an unfortunate way, right? So we saw what happened with George Floyd. We saw how not just the United States, but globally, people responded to an event like this. And we saw that it promoted kind of an awareness and an eye-opening experience for those who maybe weren't as involved or educated to things that were going on. So I do feel like that's part of the reason why there was such a push to get House Bill 3979 passed. As a teacher, I'm discouraged because current events are critical, because I feel like in a classroom, students feel this is a safe environment. This is an environment where I can have open and honest dialogue about things that I may not be aware of or have some confusion with. And as a teacher, we want to provide clarity. We want to be able to have those conversations with our students and just present the facts. So now this bill kind of backs me into a corner where I cannot even present the facts because someone may be offended, or the facts may present in a way that, represents that there were times where one race was superior to the other, right? And so it's just a very, it's difficult because as a teacher, I feel like I'm not able to do my job. I'm not able to do what I'm passionate about, and that's educate our youth. So it's very, it's difficult.
Lakeisha, let's talk just a minute about controversial issues. Having gone through school myself, and been a teacher, I know that talking about current events is something that virtually all teachers do. And as you say, it's a place for students who come to school and want to understand what's going on in the world. They hear things from different people, but at school is a place where they can hopefully find out what really happened. But if, say with the January 6th insurrection, the way I read HB 3979, it seems to me that if you were to have a conversation with your students, you'd be required to get people, or at least read articles from people who supported the insurrection, because you can't give deference to any one particular side. And that seems a little odd to me. Is that the way you read it?
Yes, that is the way I read it. And, I even think back, yes, January 6th, but I think back to my own educational experience. And I don't ever remember a history class where we talked about World War II and we read the perspective of the Nazi soldiers.
Representative Gonzalez, is that how you read the bill, that it no longer, at least legally permissible for teachers to talk about any kind of controversial event, regardless of whether there is a legitimate side to it, without taking into account both sides? The Unite the Right, very violent riot that occurred in Charlottesville in 2017. I suppose if students came in and wanted to know what happened, why there was the violence and why someone was killed there, why 35 people were injured, you'd have to get people from the KKK who were responsible for instigating the protest in the beginning. Is that your reading of the bill?
Yes, it is. And it's sad because the other part of the bill doesn't really have consequences per se. Like, if you do this what happens. The problem with that is it creates more anxiety about, well, what will happen if I do something wrong? Like, for example, let's say you bring up a current event and you try to bring up various viewpoints, but you give one viewpoint more time, and then a student talks to their parent about that. And then there is a domino effect of, well, am I in trouble now? What does that trouble look like to me? And what does it mean for different districts that maybe are a little bit more conservative, and may create more harsh penalties for educators or not? But the ambiguity creates anxiety, and puts really educators in a very precarious position.
Dr. Hinojosa, one aspect of the bill is that teachers really can't talk about racism anymore, at least not unless it's sort of tied to an individual. But the idea that there might have been, or that there was, or currently is something referred to as systemic racism that is kind of part of our institutions and practices, is not something that teachers are allowed to talk about. Isn't that going to place some pretty severe restrictions on what happens in civics classes and history classes in your district?
Well, I'm a former government teacher and a former history teacher, and this would take away all of your academic freedom. And in fact, when I taught many years ago, back in the early 80s, I taught Mexican-American studies in Dallas ISD as a teacher. But when we studied the Alamo, part of the when I remember when I was a kid, when I had to learn Texas history, and they talked about the goal at the Alamo was to slaughter all the Mexicans. Can you imagine how I felt as a kid, and that's what the goal was? And then so when I became a history teacher, I made sure that we taught the Alamo from multiple perspectives. And I brought in some primary sources and had the students read that, and they could see the multiple perspectives. But I was doing this on my own, 40, 50 years ago. But now we can't even do that. Teachers have no academic freedom. They can't do these kinds of things unless they're very careful to follow this letter of this law. And that's why I say this is all going to be played out in the courts when there is some enforcement, and then there is going to be some kind of judicial interpretation, whether this is constitutional or not.
I don't read anything in the bill in Texas that about sanctions that can be imposed on teachers and on school districts. In Tennessee, they have a similar bill, and what they did do was write in penalties, and school districts can be fined up to $500,000 if teachers in their district engage in these kinds of practices. But Lakeisha, let me ask you, are you or are your colleagues concerned about what might happen to you if you engage in some of these practices that are now outlawed?
Absolutely. And this comes at a time where we're still trying to wrap our heads and our curriculum around COVID and the great disparaging things that have come from that, right? And we're at the start of the new school year. Our curriculum is basically governed by TEKS, which are our state standards. And there are some events and historical topics included in our TEKS that we're supposed to teach. And so now we don't just have teachers who are worried about students coming back face-to-face or virtual learning. What does that look like? We also have teachers who are worried, how do I ensure that I'm meeting the standards while also maintaining, the integrity that comes along with House Bill 3979. So it's extremely frustrating because we have children who need us at 100%, who need us to help close some of those gaps that they now have due to the pandemic. But we're also treading fine lines to make sure that we're not, violating this new law. So it's incredibly frustrating. Again, like I said, it puts teachers in an uncomfortable situation because at the end of the day, we want to do what's best for our kids. We want to educate our students. I also feel that there's some misinformation along critical race theory versus culturally responsive teaching. Now, any rational person could look at our Texas education standards and see that critical race theory is not taught in public education. That's not something that's in our TEKS at all, anywhere. So, this misinformation is really fueling the fire. That's a big part of this. And I wish that people would actually take a second, have a conversation with the teacher, look at our standards, and then you would know this is not even what we're doing here in schools. The legislation is spending time worrying about bills like this when we should be addressing what happened in February. Let's address ERCOT. Let's address, lack of funding for our schools. Let's address the teacher shortage.
I want to ask all of you about another aspect of the bill. And that has to do with the ban on political activism, which, on the surface says, do you want our schools becoming political places where teachers are promoting their own political agendas through their students? And I would say most of us would say we don't want that. But just 2 days ago, I interviewed in a podcast episode around civic engagement, a 7th grade civics teacher from Panama City, Florida. Happens to be a pretty conservative area of Florida. And one of the things she described was how in her required civics course, her students frequently think about problems that exist in their community, and they then try to do something, study the problem, and figure out what they can do about it. So they've had some Category 5 hurricanes in Florida, as you know, and they, in their community in Panama City, were experiencing persistent flooding, and the students were concerned about it. It affected all of them. So they started to study the problem to figure out who was responsible for solving that problem and keeping water out of their houses and out of their schools. And so they contacted legislators, and they had a very meaningful engagement and eventually helped solve that problem. And they did it by contacting directly their legislators and other local lawmakers to find out what could be done to solve the problem. Well, obviously they learned a lot. They learned some important lessons about how you become active in solving a problem. And they weren't just learning about civics, they were doing civics. But I read this HB 3979 excerpt of the bill to the teacher in Florida, and I said that kind of activity would be banned because that's specifically mentioned in this bill. So I'm just wondering what all of you think about the idea that civics teachers, and Michael, you were a government teacher, I suspect you had students going out and trying to put into practice what they were learning, but now teachers can't do that with their students as of September 1st in Texas.
Yeah, let me start by, because this is kind of ironic, because we had a school shooting in Texas, down in the Gulf Coast, and it was very bad. So the governor actually commissioned a group of people, and I was on that committee to talk about how we get solutions. And so he encouraged all of us to get people involved. And I went and I got my teen board involved. And my teen board had these multiple meetings all over. My teen board consists of 2 students from every high school. We have 37 high schools. So they convened people about how to get solutions. They came up with suggestions about how we identify issues that help mitigate these school shootings. I couldn't have done that if this law passes. Well, it's already passed. As of September 1st, I can't use my teen board in that way, because they will become advocating for a solution through some kind of legislative feedback process. So that's one perfect example of something that was very useful, driven actually by this state administration that I could no longer use.
Lakeisha, I suspect you've done some activities with your students where you try to get them involved. Say,
yes, that's just the same as our student advisory board. And so there are, issues, topics that are presented to this board, and they collaborate and think of, solutions or ways to mitigate and resolve these problems. And now with House Bill 3979, we take away our students' voices. We take away the opportunity for them to engage in civics in real life, to take what they're learning in the classroom and to apply that. And, that's exactly the situation that we will be put into. And again, an additional stress at an already strained time, and it just seems unnecessary.
It seems to me that what legislators may have had in mind here is that they don't want teachers promoting their own personal political agendas through their students, telling their students to take a position on something and then write their legislators. They don't want giving students credit for that. But my understanding, and having been an educator most of my life, that's not something that's acceptable to begin with. And teachers are evaluated and would be admonished if they were pushing their own personal political agenda. Isn't that right, Superintendent Hinojosa?
Yes, in fact, when we have a bond election, we cannot advocate. All we can do is inform. If someone wants to advocate for a bond election that's going to benefit our district, it has to be an outside political action committee. So there are already laws and protections that don't allow you to advocate for something that would benefit you. So they already have that protection. So that part was unnecessary.
Yeah, right.
And I don't think that's what teachers are in their classrooms doing. We're not, forcing or encouraging our students to vote this way or that way, or to think this way or that way, but we should have the option and the ability to promote critical thinking. So if a teacher presents information and students come across, make a decision themselves, it's an informed decision based on information or facts that were provided to them. So I don't believe that teachers are saying you need to be with party A or party B. That is just not happening. That's, again, misinformation.
Yeah, and shouldn't be happening. And as Dr. Hinojosa said, there are rules and regulations in place that prevent that kind of thing from happening. We're coming towards the end of our time, and before we sign off, I want to ask each of you to just share your own thoughts about the degree to which you're concerned about the future of our democracy, both in Texas and in this country, and what role you think schools can play in protecting our democracy. Representative Gonzalez, you want to respond first to that question?
I give talks to classrooms a lot as a legislator. And lately I've been asking the same question when I start. I ask them, do you raise your hand if you feel democracy is in trouble? And every time lately, all hands are in the air. And I think it's really sad that the younger generation, kids in community college classes back home, high school seniors, are feeling this angst about the status and health of our democracy. Now more than ever, I think schools are at the forefront of really helping young people and society as a whole understand our role as people in this country, and the democracy is not innate, that it has to be cultivated, and it has to be taught, and it has to be experienced. And so, kind of being a bridge between the democracy question and what's in the bill. And the hardest part for me, and one of the pieces that I pushed back against, was the part of the bill, it's a participation in any internship, practicum, or similar activity involving social or public policy advocacy. That means even, like, for example, in my district, Clint FFA works at the Humane Society, and the Humane Society is a public advocacy organization. Like, even things like that would be, and when we asked Ledge Council, these were concerns. And so now more than ever, we need young people to be involved, and to put any barriers to that is really sad, a sad moment for our democracy. And so I'm a little bit nervous, and I hope people see the larger implications of this piece of legislation.
I think we take for granted that we grow up, people like myself who have grown up in this country, we kind of take for granted that we live in a democratic society. But what if we didn't have democracy anymore, or that it was severely curtailed? What would we be left with?
I often have a quip. I say, democracy sometimes is messy and ugly, but it's the best thing going. There is nothing better. And so I do think it's at peril. When you saw what happened on January the 6th, when someone wouldn't accept what the voters had decided and then tried to make up a big lie. Yes, it's at peril. If you don't, that's a microcosm of everything that's going on. And now you come locally to the state of Texas, and you see these things that are trying to get pushed through, and it leaves our legislators at no recourse except not allowing them to have a quorum so they can pass a bad law to either restrict voters or to pass some of these things. And so I think it takes a courageous act to try to protect our democracy, despite the criticism that some of them may give. So I, similarly with this mask mandate, how can we not be allowed to have tools to protect the safety of students, staff, and families? So it is at peril, and every one of us have to be courageous in our own way to do our part to step up and not accept what they're trying to do.
Thank you for that. Lakeisha, some thoughts about the state of our democracy?
I agree with both of my I agree with both. I feel that we're in a critical time. And like Dr. Hinojosa said, we need to be courageous. Without democracy, where are we? There are other countries that we can look at and see what failed democracy looks like. And that's definitely not something that I would want for myself or my children, my grandchildren and future generations to come. So now is the time to be courageous. Now is the time to speak up. Now is the time to say that this is not okay. This is not what we're working towards. This is not united, and we need to be brave. We have to advocate for change together. We have to speak up when we see an injustice. And this is definitely a time where this is unjust. This is just leading to systemic, racism, basically. And so democracy is in peril, and we have to get it together. We have to speak up and advocate for change.
I think with that, we'll come to a close. And I just want to say that I want to thank all of you for being part of this really important conversation. And I also want to express my own hope that all of you in Texas remain safe and healthy, and especially the students. All of the students in Texas remain healthy and safe in the coming months ahead. It's going to be a very, very challenging time. And so appreciate what you're trying to do to make sure that they are healthy and safe. Teacher Story listeners and viewers, I want to thank you for tuning in. If you go to teacherstories.org, you will find more episodes in our series focused on what schools can do to help save our democracy. And of course, you'll find a whole collection of stories about teachers and the profound impact so many of them have on students and communities, and yes, on our democracy. So with that, I'm going to sign off and thank all of you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.